Hey, welcome to our discussion of the Muckrakers. Mark Twain called this time period the Gilded Age. Gild is something, an object that is gilded is like gold or silver on the outside, and underneath it is a base, worthless metal, like iron or zinc or something that's going to turn your skin green. And so he was saying that this time period, the rapid industrialization was a lot like that. That your On the outside, it's beautiful. Our military is becoming more powerful. Our economy is growing. We are expanding. We're inventing new things. We have new markets. Everything seems to be really nice looking. But if you scratch the surface a little bit, you can see that it's built by exploiting workers. It's built by lying to consumers. It's built by exploiting other people, particularly immigrants. And so that was kind of an ugly thing. And the people who worked the hardest to scratch that surface were the muckrakers. People like Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis was an immigrant from Denmark, arrived in this country with not very much money, and things did not go well for him at first. But later he publishes a book. He lands on his feet, publishes a book called How the Other Half Lives. And during this time, he used photography and stories to make people who didn't live in New York or lived in the better parts of New York aware of what life was like in the slums of New York and what he called the other half. And it was terrible. I think I've got a link to a video on it on this week's lecture stuff. But and I'll just tell you one story. What he would do is he would take the pictures and he would combine it with narrative, what we now call photojournalism. And so he told the story of one called Flowers for a Lady. He worked on the edge of the slums at a place called Printers Square, and he would purchase flowers for his office. His office was gray, the view outside was gray, the sky was gray because of air pollution, and a little splash of color was what he needed to keep his life balanced. And one day these kids knock on his door, and because he would buy flowers every morning, he would throw the old ones out. And so they asked him if they could have his old trash flowers. And he said, well, I guess, sure. What are you going to use them for? And he goes, well, they're for my mother. They're for our mother. So being a good journalist, he gives them the flowers. He also gives them his new flowers, by the way. And then he grabs his camera and his pen and he follows them, thinking that they're going to go up into one of these tenements, these buildings that may have no light, no plumbing, and overcrowded. And maybe their mother's birthday, or maybe their mother is sick. They're trying to cheer her up. And instead of going to the tenement, they turn and they're going down to the local church. And he follows them in and find out that their mother has died of tuberculosis. And they are so poor they can't afford flowers for her funeral. And so the only flowers that the lady had were the flowers that he was throwing into the garbage. That was how the other half lived. And that book awakened a sense of outrage in America. They demanded changes in building codes. They demanded changes in how we treat workers. Another famous muckraker was a woman by the name of Nellie Bly. That was not her real name. That's what she wrote under. Nellie Bly pretended to be insane so she could get herself committed to a madhouse. And she wrote a book called The 10 Days in the Madhouse. And after 10 days, her lawyer and publisher came and got her out. But while she was in there, she found out that the women were chained to beds. They were given the food that the prisoners at Rikers Island in New York rejected. They got it the next day, so it was nasty, moldy, worm-infested. They weren't really given any medical care. They were just chained to their beds, and when it was shower time, they would hose them down with a fire hose. They weren't being helped. And what's more is many of them actually weren't sick. Many of them were committed because they were homeless, they didn't speak English, so they assumed they were insane. Or maybe it was their husband there were no divorce laws in those days, so maybe he didn't love her as much as he used to, and he had a mistress that he wanted to move in, and you couldn't divorce your wife, so you have her committed into an asylum. If you ever saw the movie Beauty and the Beast, where Gaston is bribing the guy who operates the asylum to come and get Belle's father, to have him committed for being crazy, Those sorts of things really did happen. Men put their wives in insane asylums so that they could shack up with their mistress instead. They would move the mistress in instead. And so this was being exposed. And after this series of articles comes about, then they begin to demand change in there. If you're going to be in a hospital, you actually have to receive some sort of a treatment. And that treatment really should be based on best practices. Now, is it going to change and everything's wonderful? No, it's not, because psychiatry was in its infancy, and so we're still working on what that means. What is best practices? So they would still put them in isolation because they felt like that was best for them. But now they actually had to give them some sort of a treatment. They can't just lock them up. And what's more is you had to have some sort of a you couldn't be institutionalized against your will without going before a court and having a judge commit you, and you got a chance to defend yourself in that courtroom. And so it wasn't just your husband coming in and going, I'm tired of you, I want the younger model, and so I'm going to have you committed to a madhouse. Another, probably the most famous book from this time period is called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And Upton Sinclair was a socialist who was trying to convince America that the capitalist system exploits workers. And he just happened to pick the meatpacking industry in Chicago as the subject or the setting for his book. He later said that he aimed for their heart, America's heart, and he hit them in the stomach. Because what he did was he described the conditions in the work in the meatpacking industry, and they were so absolutely vomitously gross that people demanded change. For example, you would scratch yourself because they never cleaned anything because there was no reason to. It's just going to be cooked later, and that would kill anything. Okay, and so they would, but if workers cut off a finger, it would just go into the meat, into the brine, where it might be turned into ground meat. Put into chili and spam or canned meats and stuff like this, and it was really, really gross. Cows would come in, they'd be dead, and they'd have flies all over them, and they'd have that rancid smell of being already starting to decay, and they would butcher them and still serve them up and send them to the market. You had your grade A, like the grade A was the cow that came in on the hoof and was healthy until they killed it. And that meat would be more expensive and would go to some of the better upscale markets, whereas some of the other meats, they put it in the gravy, they put it into brine, they would turn it into gelatin, jello, and so there's a lot of different things that they did to try to preserve this. Hormel, the guy at Hormel Foods, said that nothing is wasted except the squeak when referring to how that they prepared all the meat. But it was gross. It was disgusting. They're pretty gross anyway, but it was really disgusting. The lack of sanitation, there's no guarantee the meat that you're eating is actually cow or pig or whatever it's supposed to be. If there was a rat in the thing, they would just smack it and it would fall into the meat grinder, and that was okay. People would lose fingers. It would go into the meat grinder. That was okay. We didn't care. We just keep on going. It was really, really gross. And that just absolutely makes you want to vomit. And what would end up happening then is people demanded change. And so there's two laws that are going to come because of that. One is the Meat Inspection Act, and the other one is the Pure Food and Drug Act. Because see, along the same time, there's also these people making all these claims about what they call patent medicine or snake oil. And it was always basically the same thing. Someone would say this is some sort of ancient Chinese herbal recipe that would cure everything. You come in and go, oh, my knee hurts, I've got arthritis. One glass of this will cure you. I'd come in, oh, I've got eyesight problems. Oh, one glass of this will cure you. Oh, I've got headache. Oh, one glass of this will cure you. My hair's falling out, or, I have depression, or I have anxiety. It didn't matter. Man, this stuff cured everything. Only it was just rot gut whiskey. It wasn't even good rot gut whiskey. It'd be like 192 proof, and they may take some kitchen herbs like garlic and basil and something that ought to be in an Italian food, right? So they give it a little bit of color and give it a little flavor, because if it tastes bad, it must be better for you. And they would sell that, but there was no evidence it did anything. They would compounding pharmacies. They could make up their own medicines. Coca-Cola was sold as a medicine to treat depression and tiredness, and maybe it's because it had cocaine in it. But the Food and Drug Act comes in and says, number one, you got to tell people what they're drinking and eating, and it's got to actually be what's in there. You can't just say this is beef and it actually is something other than beef. And so the Food and Drug Act, and people say, well, wait a minute, I don't, like Coca-Cola, for example, comes and says, I don't want people knowing the secret recipe to Coca-Cola. Well, they still have to share that with the Food and Drug Administration. So the Food and Drug Administration can look at it and go, you're putting what in your food? Like, for example, I mean, Coca-Cola used to have cocaine, which we now know is highly addictive. Dr. Pepper used to have ethylene glycol. Ethylene glycol is a sweet but very poisonous substance that causes kidney stones. It's mostly used to as an antifreeze. So this was some pretty nasty, nasty stuff that was going on. So because of these muckrakers, and because they drew the attention of the American people demanded change. And some of those changes, they didn't fix everything. Nothing could fix everything. But they still managed to get a lot done. It's going to be more successful on a local level than a national level because local level laws are easier to pass. Plus, local laws like zoning codes actually have a bigger effect on the way people live. I mean, you think about it, how your house is built, which is something that local and state laws have, is much more important to you than some of these other things. All right, till then, I'll talk to you later, and I hope you have a great day.